Chapter 2. The problem of our redemption through the integration of evil is illuminated from another and surprising angle by a medieval German legend of the 15th century, a dark, uncanny version of the life of St. John Chrysostom, John Goldenmouth, the celebrated bishop of Constantinople who was born at Antioch about AD 345. He won the love of his people by his gift of eloquence, and the hatred of many of the court and cloister by his zeal for ascetic reform. Having brought synods, emperors, and popes to heel, he died in exile at the age of 62. The strange story goes that there was once in Rome a pope who used to ride abroad on horseback with his knights, and it was his custom during these excursions to draw away from his suite and while remaining in the saddle recite his prayers alone. On one of these pious occasions he heard a voice crying, and he thought, "What a pitiable voice!" He rode in its direction, but when he heard it again and looked about, there was no one to be seen. The Pope realized that he must have been overhearing the lamentations of a ghost, so he bade the spirit, in the name of God, to declare itself. "I am a miserable soul," the voice answered mournfully, "suffering in the flames of hell." In pity, the Pope inquired how the poor thing might be relieved of its pain. "You cannot help," came the reply, "but there is in Rome a certain pious man married to a virtuous wife, and I know that she has conceived by him a child that is to be a blessed man called John, and he will become a priest. Now, if that priest will say 16 masses on my behalf, I shall be released from these fires of hell." The soul then told in what street the parents would be found, and what their names were, and with a final blood-curdling scream was gone. The Pope returned to the city and inquired after the pious couple. When they were found, he begged them to tell him when their child was to be born. He had the infant carried to his court, where he christened it John, and took it into his protection, caring for it as though it were his own son. John, at the age of 7, was sent to school, but was conspicuously poor in his studies. The other boys began to make mock of him, and he was ashamed. So, when he went to church every morning, he prayed before the image of Our Lady that she should help him in his work. One day the lips of the image moved, and the Virgin spoke. "John, kiss my mouth," she said, "and you shall be filled with knowledge and become the master of all arts. You shall become more learned than any man on earth." The boy was afraid, but the image gave him courage. "Kiss me, John. Come, do not be afraid." He pressed his trembling mouth to the lips of the Blessed Lady, kissed her, and by that kiss drew into himself wisdom and a miraculous knowledge of the arts. John returned to the school, and he settled down to listen and learn, but it transpired that he knew more than all the others together and no longer required to be taught. There was a golden circlet around his mouth, and it shone like a star. His companions were astonished. "How does it happen that you now know everything?" they demanded. "Only yesterday not even a flogging could teach you." He described to them the miraculous event by which he had acquired his golden sign, and they called him Goldenmouth. "You deserve this title," they said, "for the words from your mouth are as gold." And thereafter it was John Goldenmouth who did all the teaching in the school. The good Pope entertained a great love for John Goldenmouth, and since he was impatient to release the suffering soul from hell, had the boy ordained as soon as possible. John celebrated his first Mass at the age of 16, but while he was at the altar a disquieting thought occurred to him. "O Lord, I am as yet too young. To become a priest in communion with God before being really prepared must be contrary to the heavenly will. I am going to rue this day forever." He continued saying the Mass, but a resolution was taking shape in his mind. "Temporal possessions are bad for the soul. I therefore pledge myself to be poor for the sake of God. When the banquet in honor of my first Mass is over, I shall withdraw to the wilderness and remain there as a hermit as long as I live. Would that this Mass were over," he thought. "Oh, but it is long." The Pope, full of joy, held a banquet for John Goldenmouth, and everybody rejoiced at the early ordination, but the young priest remained firm in his resolve. When the company had dispersed, he stole away clad in poor clothes and carrying scarcely a loaf of bread. When the Pope learned of this event, he was greatly troubled, and together with his suite searched everywhere for the vanished prodigy. But John had built himself a hut of bark and leaves in a hidden fastness of the wilderness, beside a spring and at the edge of a cliff. The hermitage was not discovered. Subsisting on roots and herbs, he remained there, and he served God day and night. He prayed, he fasted, and he kept himself continuously awake, steadfast in devotion. Now, not far from the forest in which John had built his hermitage, there lived an emperor in a castle, and one day the daughter of this emperor went with the maidens of her suite to gather flowers. A sudden gale arose, swept the country, and was so terribly strong that it lifted all the frightened maidens high into the air. When they were set down again, they discovered that the princess was no longer among them, nor could they imagine in what direction she might have been blown. The emperor, of course, was distracted when he was told, and searched diligently and extensively, but the beautiful royal maid could not be found. Actually, she had been set down by the gale precisely at the door of John's hermitage, quite unhurt. She was lost and bewildered, but seeing the little hut and John within it, who was kneeling at his prayers, felt reassured. She called. Hearing the clear voice, the saintly youth turned his head, and when he perceived her, was alarmed. The apparition implored him not to leave her outside to die of hunger or to fall prey to the animals of the forest, and at last he was persuaded to admit her to the cell, for he considered that he should be guilty before God if he permitted her to die. John took his staff, however, and drawing a line across the floor of the cell, divided it in two. One side he assigned to the girl, and he commanded her not to cross the line, but to lead in her part of the cell such a life as should befit a proper recluse. They continued for a while, side by side in this way, praying, fasting, and serving God, but the tempter envied them their life and sanctity. He succeeded one night in provoking John to cross the line and take the girl in his arms, whereupon they fell into sin, and after that they were smitten with remorse. John was afraid that if the girl should remain with him, he would fall again, so he conducted her to the edge of the cliff and pushed her over. But the moment he had done this, he understood that he had sinned even worse than before. "Oh, wretched, accursed creature that I am," he cried. "Now I have murdered this innocent girl. She would never have thought of sin had I not seduced her, and I have deprived her now of her life. God certainly will avenge this terrible sin on me forever." John quit his hermitage in despair and left the wilderness. "Lord my God," he lamented, "thou hast forsaken me." After a time he felt a little hope. "I shall confess," he decided, and so he proceeded to the Pope, confessed his sin, and professed repentance. But his godfather, who did not recognize him, turned him away in a terrible storm of indignation. "Depart from my sight. You have dealt bestially with this innocent girl," said the Pope, "and the sin is on your head." "I shall not doubt God," John thought, and he returned deeply afflicted to his hut, where he knelt and made his solemn prayer and vow. "May God, whose mercy is greater than my sin, accept graciously the penance I am about to impose upon myself. I vow to walk on all fours like a beast until I shall have earned God's grace. God in his mercy will let me know when I have atoned." And he went down on his hands and moved about on all fours, and when he grew tired, he would creep into the hut and lie down there like a beast. He existed in this manner many years, never drawing his body up to standing posture. His garment rotted and fell away, his skin grew rough and hairy, and he became unrecognizable as a human being. Meanwhile, it so happened that the wife of the emperor gave birth to another child, and the Pope was asked to baptize it. He came and took the infant in his arms, but it cried out loudly, "You are not the one to baptize me." The Pope was astonished and afraid, and tried to quiet the babe, but it persisted in its resistance. And when its will was sought, it replied, "Saint John the Holy Man is the one who is going to baptize me. God will send him to me from the wilderness." The Pope returned the child to the nurse, and going to the Empress, inquired, "Who is this Saint John that is to baptize the babe?" But no one knew. About this time the hounds of the huntsmen of the emperor ran down a very curious beast. The men could not imagine what it was, but since it gave no resistance, they readily captured it, and throwing a cloak around it, bound its legs. Then they brought it to the emperor's castle, and the rumor went out, and many people came to look at it, but the animal crept under a bench and tried to hide. The nurse with the child was among the visitors, and there were present at the time many knights and ladies. The child commanded, "Show me the beast." A servant stirred it from its hiding place, and twice it made its way back, but the third time it remained in view. Then the newborn infant addressed it. "John, dear Lord," it said with a firm, clear voice, "I am to receive baptism by your hand." The uncouth creature, on all fours, hairy, weird, lifted a voice that was firm and clear and made reply, "If your words be true, and this is the will of God, speak once again." The newborn infant answered, "Dear Father, why do you tarry? I am to be baptized by your hand." Whereupon John called aloud to God, "O Lord, let me know by the voice of this child if my sins be atoned." And the child continued, "Dear John, rejoice, for God has forgiven you all your sins. Arise therefore, and in the name of God baptize me." John lifted his body from the ground and rose up like a human being. The filth and dirt that clung to his skin fell away immediately like withered bark, and his body became clean again, bright and smooth. But they brought him clothing. The Pope and nobles bade him welcome. When John had baptized the babe, the Pope invited him to sit down. "Dear Father," John asked, "do you not know me?" "No," the Pope replied, "I do not." John said, "I am your godchild. You baptized me with your own hands, sent me to school, and while I was still a very young lad, ordained me. But while celebrating my first Mass, I thought it unseemly to take the host in my unready hands, and so, after the Mass and the following banquet, I stole away to the wilderness where I have prayed, suffered, sinned, and repented these many years." John described in all candor how he had seduced the maid and murdered her, and confessed his sin to the Pope himself. The emperor was informed of the story, and his heart grew heavy. "That was my beloved daughter," he thought, and he prayed to John to conduct him to the cliff where the girl had been killed. They might recover her bones, he said, and accord them decent Christian burial. So John guided the huntsmen to the hut where they had captured him, and then rode with them through the forest to the cliff. When they peered over the brink, they beheld a young woman quietly sitting below. John called to the solitary figure, "Why are you sitting like this, alone at the base of the cliff?" She answered, "Do you not see who I am?" "No," said John, "I do not." "I am the one who came to your cell," she said, "and you thrust me over the brink." John was amazed. "God bore me up," she said, "so that I came to no harm." And by a great miracle she was as beautiful there as she had ever been, and she was clothed in royal garments. The emperor and empress took her to their hearts, giving thanks to God for her recovery, and the Pope then departed for Rome, requiring John to go with him. "How many masses have you said, dear John?" the Pope asked. "Oh, not more than that one," John replied. "Alas!" said the Pope, "what is it, my dear father?" "I am filled with woe at the thought of that poor soul still suffering in the fires of hell." John said, "Oh, my holy father, what do you mean?" Then his godfather described to him the encounter with the suffering voice, and John learned that he could redeem the soul by the saying of 16 masses. "That," said the Pope, "is why I brought you up to be a priest." John offered up one Mass a day for 16 days, and the suffering soul was rescued from its pain. The Pope in due time made John a bishop, and he filled the office with humility, serving God with the utmost devotion. His sermons were like chaplets of gold, and he was called again John Goldenmouth, and he wrote many books about God. When his ink ran out, he would go on writing from his mouth, and the letters that then flowed from his pen were of purest gold.